You're listening to the Business for Good podcast, the show where you'll hear inspirational stories about companies making money by solving some of the world's most pressing problems. I'm your host, Paul Shapiro, and I'm glad you've joined us. Welcome, friend, to episode 149 of the Business for Good podcast. I am so glad that many of you got a lot out of the last episode with Oshi CEO Ofek Ron. If you didn't catch it, I think you'll really find inspiration in the story. I know I certainly did. And that is a big reason that I host the show. Yes, I want to showcase people and companies doing really cool things to solve global problems, but it's also to inspire people to hopefully do something great for the world themselves, too. Whenever I hear from listeners who've invested in companies they've heard on this show, joined the ranks of these companies' employees, or even started their own companies, I'm always extremely heartened. I don't make any money doing this show. There are no ads, no sponsors or anything like that. I just do it because I think it may do some good, whether good for animals, good for the planet, good for humanity. So hearing from listeners on whom the show's made an impact is a reward in and of itself for me, honestly. But I was particularly gratified when it was pointed out to me recently that the Business for Good podcast is now in the top 1% of podcasts globally by popularity, according to podcast ranker Listen Notes. Of course, there are many podcasts with far larger audiences than this one, but it's great to know that a show focused solely on people doing good in the world can still break into that top 1% category. So please let me say thank you. I'm grateful to you, the listener, for downloading these episodes, for sharing them, and most importantly, for all you're doing in your life to take action to try to make a positive difference for others through your own life as well. That's what this show is about, and I'm very pleased that there are a lot of people finding real use in it. So thank you again to each of you for helping fulfill the show's mission. And speaking of mission, if you have been listening for some time, you probably know that my life has been a long mission to help shift humanity away from animal-based proteins toward plant-based proteins. So let's talk about that, because that's what this episode is all about. Today, alternative meat is typically made from soybeans, yellow peas, wheat, or some combination of those three crops. But there is a whole world of plants out there, and maybe some of them can be harnessed to widen the world of ingredients available to manufacturers, perhaps even offering better functionality and flavor. One of the problems, though, is that making protein isolates from most beans or lentils can be pretty expensive, since these crops usually are not that high in protein to begin with. One reason why soy protein is so much cheaper than pea protein, for example, is that the soybean is typically 30 to 40% protein by dry weight, whereas the yellow pea is more like 25% at best. So you need to grow fewer soybeans to get the same amount of protein. Well, with chickpeas, the situation is sadly even worse, as they're usually more like 20% protein. Enter NuCicer, a startup in Davis, California, just down the street from me, that has leveraged the power of natural plant diversity to breed a chickpea with 35% protein, and which they say has superior flavor and functionality compared to pea protein, a common ingredient in alternative meat today. That explains one reason why alternative meat is generally more expensive than animal meat, because you're not just using peas, you're using a very tiny fraction of the pea, which means you have to grow a whole lot more peas and subject it to various processes. Now, how has NuCicer done this? They have done this by taking today's commodity chickpea, the only domesticated species within the Cicer genus, and bred it with wild relatives that never made it into the basket of legumes which were domesticated by the humans living in the Middle East thousands and thousands of years ago when the chickpea was first domesticated. The result is a chickpea with 75% more protein than the typical chickpea, reducing the cost of chickpea protein by about 50%, surely a whopping number. Already, NuCicer is growing its high-protein chickpeas on 1,000 acres across 5 states and is moving fast to scale up. So, does a new world of alt meats, high-protein hummus, and even chickpea-powered proteinaceous oatmeal await? The father-daughter duo that co-founded NuCicer certainly hopes so. That daughter, Catherine Cook, serves as the CEO and is on the show this episode to tell you all about her journey from her first chapter as an aerospace engineer to now a CEO engineering a better chickpea. Catherine, welcome to the Business for Good podcast.
Hello. Thanks for having me, Paul.
Hey, it's really great to be chatting with you. We've known each other for a number of years, so I'm glad that we're finally getting to record together, because I've been admiring what you are doing. And I'm eager to talk all about that. But before we get into your role as the queen of chickpeas, I have to ask, I imagine that your life was not destined toward this route. You were a Boeing engineer when you were doing aerospace engineering. Were you thinking, one day I'm going to harness the power of chickpeas?
No, the short answer is no. In fact, I grew up in my dad's lab at a university. I mean, in concept, and growing up in kind of a lab in biosciences and plant biology, I honestly wanted to get as far away from that as I could.
Well, I'm glad that you said.
Surprising.
I'm glad you said you grew up in the lab in concept, because I was envisioning you as being like a test experiment in your father's lab. So we'll get to this in a little bit, but just to be clear, your father was at UC Davis and was researching what?
Yeah, he's spent over 35 years working to understand the genetic controls behind key legume traits, such as nitrogen fixation and how legumes have evolved.
What an amazing career just to focus on the genetics of legumes. That is really an amazing niche. What a world that job exists. So, all right, you grow up, you're not actually confined in the lab, but you're metaphorically growing up in this lab, and you don't want to have anything to do with legumes. And instead of looking at how to fix nitrogen in the ground, you're looking up toward the heavens and you're thinking, how can I become an aerospace engineer? Is that how it transpired?
Actually, there was kind of an intermediary. I'm one of those people who grew up loving math and science and trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And so, general engineering kind of was a very obvious fit for me in college. But as I started taking classes, I started to realize that I was struggling to understand and connect really with some of the concepts. That the math made sense, but not why. And as I got into the why, the only set of classes and the only major that was able to kind of satisfy that curiosity for me was actually materials engineering, because it meant going literally all the way to the atomic level of understanding how materials are behaving. And only then did I feel comfortable accepting some of the more, I'll call them more abstract principles in mechanical engineering or electrical engineering or computer programming languages. So for me, it actually literally started by diving as far as I could into the why. And then aerospace happened to be an application of that for me. So thinking about the materials that are used on aircraft, thinking about the implications at the chemical level and at the processing level that actually enables us to, travel around the globe.
Interesting. And at some point, you're traveling around the globe and you're thinking, all right, I'm doing this really cool aerospace engineering. You have a career that most people would be very envious of, working at Boeing. And then you decide you're going to Facebook. Why?
Yeah. So, well, part of it was personal. Sometimes we are pushed out of our comfort zones on our personal life as well. And I was living up in Seattle, and my fiance at the time decided he wanted to move back to California. And so I started thinking about, what could I possibly do in aerospace in the Bay Area? And I remember getting a call from a Facebook recruiter saying, hey, we've got a high altitude, long endurance aircraft program, and we've got a technical program manager position open. We'd like you to apply. And I think immediately I thought this was literally a prank phone call. I said, did you call the right number? Are you sure this is the right thing? Facebook doesn't have any aerospace programs, right? And the more I got into it, it started to really make sense. And it ended up being a really good fit for me to transition back to the Bay Area, but kind of keep that tangent, right? That the work that I'd been doing, and there was a common thread.
Do you happen to know Christy Legawi from Rebellious Foods? She was a Boeing aerospace engineer as well, who now is in the alternative meat space, similar to you.
We never officially crossed paths, but I've chatted with her.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, we've done an episode with Rebellious Foods in the past. We'll link to that in the show notes for this episode at businessforgoodpodcast.com. But I think that you two would be, two peas in a pod, or maybe two chickpeas in a pod, I should say, for reasons that we'll get into later. But I'm really eager to figure out how it came to be that you decided, Catherine, that you wanted to go back and do what your father was doing, right? You've gone on this career. You've got these two really great chapters of your career, first at Boeing and then at Facebook. And then, you decide that you want to engineer a better chickpea. So it's not exactly like an obvious path from A to B to C here. So what happened when you were at Facebook that you decided, the world needs a higher protein chickpea?
Yeah. So the reality is you just don't know where your life's going to take you. And for me, the kind of ending of my aerospace chapter, if you will, came when I started to realize that all the people around me, they were passionate about aerospace at their core, right? They'd hear an aircraft flying above, and they'd immediately, without even looking, they know what model, could describe the engines, could just start having a whole conversation. And that just wasn't my passion per se. So I shifted within Facebook and spent a few years working with their voice technology, looking at speech recognition, natural language processing, and did a lot of work with some of their machine learning teams, which was truly fascinating and eye-opening. But after a few years of that, I just started to realize that I felt disconnected with the physical world. I really missed my materials background. I missed being able to touch the product that I was working on. And at the end of the day, I didn't feel connected with the impact that I was having. When I thought about at the very beginning of my journey, when I thought about the impact I wanted to be having on society, it was really focused around sustainability and climate resiliency of how we as humans are interacting with our, the world around us. So I knew that I wanted to take a step back and kind of reevaluate where I was headed in life. So I thought about going into a bunch of different industries. And at the end of the day, food and ag really was the trifecta, if you will, of my past careers and where I wanted to have an impact. I mean, when you think about ingredients or the food itself, it's just a material. The composition, how we process it impacts the function, impacts the nutrition, the taste, the textures, all of that. It really is just a material. And not just the crops that we select, but the actual varieties that are used to make those ingredients. We have an ability through plant breeding and through plant genetics to actually create positive impacts, not just when we think about agriculture and we think about the sustainability and the climate impact of our food system, but rather how we think about the ingredient properties themselves. And so for me, that really met the materials. A lot of the data work I'd been doing kind of had some parallels, though I'm not a geneticist, some parallels in the plant science world. And then the ability to really greatly impact human health and our climate gave me the confidence to kind of make this big leap away from anything I understood and kind of going into a very different sector.
And was the idea always that you were going to start your own company, or were you thinking maybe I should join a company and do something in this space? Like, why actually start your own venture?
So this actually gets back to my dad. So I was living at the time in Redwood City in the Bay Area, and Impossible Foods was really in my backyard, if you will. I started to kind of follow what they were doing in kind of the mid 2010s, and thought maybe I'll join in that alternative protein movement. And as I started chatting, literally, sitting around the dinner table, talking to my dad about, leaving my job and kind of the job security I had and completely changing my career, I was telling him about, why I wanted to do that and everything. And I asked him, how's everything going in your neck of the woods? And he said, well, interestingly enough, we've been talking about protein in our lab and kind of the human health and nutrition, even though that is absolutely and hasn't really been a focus for him ever in his research, right? It was focused on nitrogen fixation, focused on soil microbes, focused on general legume genetics. And he started saying, we've through this journey, which I can touch on in a minute, we've discovered that we can greatly change the protein content and protein profile of chickpeas. And I said, well, there's clearly something there. Is this something that should stay in research, or is this something that needs to actually make it into the hands of consumers to have a positive impact on this alternative protein movement? And so it was really through a series of conversations over about 6 months that we started to get really confident and excited about this idea of taking a very unique germplasm library that he had developed and making it accessible to the consumer by commercializing it.
So let's talk about, we're going to talk about how you did that, but let's talk about why it's even important, right? Like, why does it matter whether chickpeas have more protein in them? So you mentioned Impossible Foods. They're already using soybeans. Soybeans are already pretty high protein, right? They have like 30 to 40% protein by dry weight. Beyond Meat is using yellow peas, which are about 25% protein by dry weight. And chickpeas are not that far behind. They're about like 20% protein by dry weight. So why does it matter if we have a more protein-packed chickpea or not?
Yeah. So one of the big challenges with plant proteins today is really around flavor, function, and cost, right? And when it comes to soy and when it comes to pea, the flavor profile is just, it's not there. It really requires consumers to adapt and as food formulators to really focus on how to mask some of the beaniness flavors that come along with those proteins. And then you add in function, right? I mean, yellow pea in particular is not a highly functional ingredient. It doesn't have strong gelation. It doesn't have great emulsification. And when we think about a lot of these, in particular alternative meat products, that texture is so important. And so all of a sudden we get this kind of laundry list of ingredients on these labels. And not only does that cause, us to think about what we're eating and, start talking about this more minimally processed movement, it also starts, frankly, just adding into the complexity of our food system. And when we think about all these different ingredients having to be sourced and moved around the globe, for me, I start really questioning, is this truly the sustainable direction that we want to go? Or is there a better tasting, better functioning, and economical ingredient out there? Today, chickpea protein serves the purpose of flavor and function, but it is way too expensive in comparison to pea and soy. You mentioned that it at the commodity level, it does have a lower protein content than both of those other legumes, but it also at the farm gate level has a higher price point. And that's because it hasn't been the focus of big breeding programs. It hasn't gotten the attention that it deserves when we think about genetic improvement, when we think about yield and yield stability. And all of those pieces combined really drive up the cost of chickpea protein to the point that today it's really being used as more of an additive rather than the protein source.
Why is it that there's been less focus on yield improvement among chickpeas? I mean, people have been eating hummus for a long time. And yellow pea I know is used in a lot of alternative meats now, but I feel like that's a relatively recent phenomenon, like in the last decade or so. But chickpeas have been popular for a long time. So why is it that the yield on chickpeas has not been improved in the way that it has, let's say, for example, the yellow pea?
Yeah. So, if we think back to the 1940s, 50s, 60s, that was kind of the time frame that we had the Green Revolution, right? There were concerns about global food security and the need to produce more on the acreage that was available. And a lot of focus then went into increasing the diversity in wheat, in corn, and rice, in soybean, and in some of the vegetables, right? Pea being a vegetable. And so we saw massive increases in yield in those crops that were, really truly the global staple crops. And one of the challenges that existed in chickpea, which is actually the key unlock that's behind NuCicer's technology. So one of the challenges in chickpea is that it turns out when chickpea was originally domesticated about 8,000 years ago, and then through further modern day breeding, what's happened is we've lost about 95% of genetic diversity in that genus. And if you go back into the wild ancestors, the wild relatives and other species in the cicer genus, which is actually where our name comes from, NuCicer, you find that there are over 40 different species of chickpea, if you will. And the ones that diverge in an evolutionary sense, 10,000 or even 100,000 years back, are still today genetically compatible with our modern day chickpea. And this is actually the research that my dad, who's actually my co-founder at NuCicer, actually went in and really evaluated and looked at, collected thousands of samples, working with the international community, and launched a very systematic cross-pollination, so crossbreeding program to really bring that genetic diversity and create a germplasm library, a physical seed library that forms the foundation and launching point for crop improvement. And so that, we think about these other staple crops where that happened, many, many, many decades ago. That hadn't happened for chickpea to the level that was required to unlock that bottleneck and now give us a platform that we need to really launch the future of chickpea. And frankly, we believe the future staple crop for our food system.
You mentioned your father and that he's this researcher who co-founded the company with you. You are the CEO, though, but it's based on his research. So what is his role in the company? If you are running the day-to-day operations, is it just he's the co-founder because it's based on his research? Is there some license that Davis has to your technology and future royalties or something like that?
Yeah, so we have a really great relationship with UC Davis and the UC system. When we founded the company, we worked with the university and we spun the technology, that library and some of the background data we have a license to. And that forms the backbone of NuCicer. Now, my dad, Doug, is started off as our chief scientific officer, so CSO for the company. And he and I, and actually a third co-founder who was also from his lab at the university, started the company together and have, worked together now for about 4.5 years. Doug leading more of the R&D side of it, and me, taking that R&D, thinking about how we translate that into a commercial product. Doug maintains his position at UC Davis. He really loves teaching and really loves diving into all different areas of plant science. And so the company has now grown to the point that just in last December, I guess, we brought in Chief Technology Officer, Sean, to really help kind of drive us forward on that R&D on a day-to-day basis, because we've now grown to the point that we need both the technology and then Doug continuing to bring that kind of science aspect of chickpea genetics.
I noticed, Catherine, you keep referring to him as Doug. Is that purposeful that you don't refer to him as Dad or my father in here? Like when you're doing business and you're in meetings with companies, are you referring to him as Doug?
Yes.
Wow. Okay. All right.
I never thought I would start a company, let alone start a company with my family. And I was clear from the very beginning that launching into this journey, I didn't want to lose my personal relationship with my dad or anyone else in the family for that matter, right? You hear about these horror stories where you go into business with family and it doesn't work out. So one of the rules I've had from day one is that at work, he is Doug, and at home, he is Dad.
Okay.
And that has
Yeah.
helped me. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. So my wife Tony and I have tried to engage in some joint projects, which have, I can tell you, not been conducive to domestic harmony. So we've abandoned that idea. But her father, his name is George, he wants to start a company called TNG, which is Tony and George. And it's unclear what they'll do right now. They don't know what they'll sell, but he wants to do something. So I'll tell them that there's an inspiration with Catherine and Doug here. So let's talk about what the company actually does. So, you're breeding chickpeas that are way higher in protein. How much higher? So if the old school chickpea is 20% protein by dry weight, what's the NuCicer chickpea?
Yeah, our first generation high protein variety goes up to about 35% protein.
Nice. So it's a huge increase.
Huge increase. It's a 75% increase and actually starts to put it into the range of soybean, which is none of the other legumes have really achieved at that level.
All right. So you've got a much higher protein chickpea. In terms of yield, though, like if you're talking about being a soybean protein content, are you near soybean productivity yet?
Yeah, so the requirement for our first generation variety, which we launched last year, was that it had to be much higher in protein, kind of a transformational leap in protein content from commodity chickpea, but that it had to maintain chickpea yields. So you couldn't sacrifice yield for protein. And so right now where we're at is from all of the testing and kind of the grower feedback, we see that we are competitive from a yield standpoint with other chickpeas, but we're bringing in this added value of that protein content.
I'm presuming, Catherine, the added protein is coming at the expense of lowered fat, right? Like something has to give if you're adding more protein. I presume it's less oil or less fat in the chickpea. Is that right?
But yes, it trades off both fat and your starches. But yes, fat does decrease, which is a really critical aspect of this.
Mm-hmm. And so would this impact let's say somebody wanted to make a higher protein hummus, but the chickpea now has less fat. Does that mean they're adding more tahini? Like, does it matter in that particular case for a hummus format?
So, a normal chickpea has, let's say, 6 to 7% oil content. These first generation varieties have between 4.5 to 5% oil content. So we're not talking about a massive shift in oil when you think about, for example, hummus, where most of that oil is coming from the tahini and added oil. But that fat content change, that oil content shift is sufficient to really be a game changer in protein extraction, which is where we're really focused on that higher protein, lower oil kind of ratio, if you will. But we don't see it impacting hummus necessarily.
Okay. So let's just get to the bottom line here. How much cheaper than chickpea protein is it today? So you've got companies like Nutriati that have been making chickpea protein for various applications, but chickpea protein is way more expensive than soy protein or pea protein or wheat protein. Like right now, if you look at plant-based meat, nearly all of it is made from soy, pea, or wheat wheat protein, or some combination of those three. So chickpea protein has not been in the same league just because of its cost. Now, you're saying that you can improve the protein by 75%. How much does that commensurately decrease the cost of the chickpea protein?
Yeah, so there are many different factors that are impacting the cost of chickpea protein content being a major driver. But when we start to add up the protein and some of the other benefits that we're bringing into the chickpea system, we really do see a near-term path to being cost competitive with yellow pea protein. When we think about, fully scaled up production for that protein and with, further improvements that we see in chickpea, our ultimate vision is to really displace pea protein in the market by being even more cost effective, but maintaining the better flavors and the better functionality that come along with chickpea protein. And we do think that is, not just a a 10-year vision, but really a near-term achievable goal in just the next few years here.
You mentioned earlier, and now you're restating it again, so I want to just hone in on this for a second here, Catherine, that soy protein and pea protein have what you refer to as a beanie flavor. Why wouldn't a chickpea, which is also a bean and a legume, why wouldn't it also have a beanie flavor? Is it you're stating it as an a priori assumption that chickpeas have a better flavor than these other peas and beans? So why is that?
Yeah, that's a very fair question. So when we think about chickpea, it's a legume. It's certainly, I'm not saying it doesn't have any beaniness to it, right? It doesn't taste like corn. It doesn't taste like wheat or rice. It is still a legume. And so it does have a little bit of that. But when we think about, all of the different beans that or peas that we have to choose from, flavor just is naturally a little bit more mild in chickpea. A lot of people describe it, a little bit beany, but a little bit nutty, creamy. It comes with just a bit more of a mild flavor profile. And that's just because of the genetics and the composition of the seed. Now, interestingly, with the very unique library that we have that brings about 40 times more genetic diversity, it gives us access not just to agronomic traits like yield and yield stability, and not just, macronutritional traits, but it actually gives us access to wide variations in flavor. So we, you work a lot in startups to a very narrow set of goals. And when you achieve those, sometimes you also get, I dare to say this, but get a little lucky, right? And I'll take it. Our first generation variety has come back. Flavor wasn't an aspect that we bred for specifically. It was more something that we kind of screened for and said, we can't launch a high protein chickpea that tastes more beany than a normal chickpea. And I think we've gotten, very fortunate that all of the customer feedback and our sensory panels that we've done actually are indicating that, particularly at the flower level, where you're not doing extraction, you can't modify the flavor. At the flower level, we're actually seeing a better tasting chickpea flour with our high protein variety than you would with just a normal chickpea flour. So that makes it, really well suited. You don't really see a lot of yellow pea pastas or soybean pastas or yellow pea bread, but you do see chickpea in those applications. And I think, again, that kind of speaks to the more nutty, neutral flavor, albeit a little beany, but more neutral flavor.
Yeah, it's an interesting point that a lot of those bean pastas are made from chickpea, like Bonza, and so those are chickpeas. So that's a very interesting point, but it does raise the question of why not do the same with yellow peas? Like, if you can really increase the protein and decrease the beaniness, why not do that with yellow pea? Or frankly, with fava beans, which are increasingly popular, like Beyond Meat using fava bean now in its Beyond Steak product and in other products that they're making. So, maybe there's a pathway for somebody, maybe NuCicer, to do that. It's not in the cicer genus, but maybe there's other legumes that you guys could be pursuing.
Yeah, and this is something that probably comes up with our internal team every 6 months. We sit down and we talk about, should we consider adding in other legumes or other crops more generally into our breeding programs? Our kind of technology platform outside of the genetics and the phenotypic, the trait data, right? Our breeding tools, our simulation tools, our databases can all be shifted over to use with other crops. But every time we do this, there are a few things that come up, right? When you're a small team, and we have about, 23, 24 people now, but still relatively small, diluting focus and trying to breed for a number of different crops and commercialize them really dilutes the amount of transformational impact that we can make on any single crop. And I think the other piece is, when we look at what we're trying to do as a company and the vision for the company, it's not just to make a high protein chickpea, and it's not just to bring down the cost of chickpea protein and open up that space. I think those are kind of table stakes for us. But the reality is we imagine a world where our food products, the center of the plate, is really promoting human health, delivering that nutritional density, satisfying our cravings, and also at the same time creating value for growers and really rejuvenating soil health. And so for us, that means that legumes have to become center of the plate. And when we evaluate chickpea, fava, pea, soy, cow bean, mung bean, the list goes on, right? We come back to the uniqueness of chickpea, not just the flavors, not just the function that it brings, but the fact that chickpea has woven itself into the fabric of human civilization for centuries. It is a very well-known and accepted ingredient in households. Not, it entered in North America, I think maybe more as hummus or a salad ingredient. But when you really date back and you think globally, it is, and from our perspective, it has the ability to truly be a staple food for our food system and fit into, starches, into proteins, thinking about the fiber, and go well beyond where we believe the food market is for the other legumes.
Okay. Well, that sounds like a pretty cool vision. I would love to have higher protein chickpeas at the center of my plate or in my hummus. That would be great. But how close are we to this vision, Catherine? I know that you all have already started some commercial production of your chickpeas in actual fields being grown by actual growers. So tell me, where are we now in terms of production of NuCicer chickpeas, and how soon are we to see it available to an everyday consumer who maybe is going to go buy the next plant-based meat that, instead of being made with yellow peas or soybeans, will be made with your chickpeas here?
Yeah. So the exciting piece of it is that we are now, this year, we're producing on over 1,000 acres of production. Those are split across 5 different states so that we have the ability to use each of those kind of regions, if you will, as a launching pad for next year, where we are anticipating over 6,000 acres of production. So relatively small in the grand scheme of things, but going through this scale-up process is a really important piece. And in terms of being able to access it, in about 2 months here, we will start delivering this high protein chickpea as ingredients both to CPG brands and to other ingredient companies that are using this high protein chickpea as their input into their products. And so as a consumer, while you won't necessarily see NuCicer's brand, you will start to be able to access products that are made with our higher protein chickpeas probably by the end of Q1 of
Q1 2025. Yeah, great. Exciting. So what will these products be? Is it going to be a pasta? Is it going to be a flour? Is it going to be a plant-based meat? Like, what is the actual first generation of the NuCicer powered products?
Yeah, so we're working with companies across a number of spaces, notably in the breakfast category, without going into too many specifics there, but some companies that are working to bring chickpeas and kind of bring a more nutritious fiber and protein breakfast products, whether that be waffles or chickpea oatmeal, or thinking about alternative proteins in our breakfast category. We're also working with companies in the pasta space, in the noodle space as well. And I think, maybe I'll just pause there and say, I think one of the really interesting pieces is we need to not just think of this as a gluten-free ingredient. And it's hard for me sometimes. Personally, I have celiacs, so I need everything that I eat to be gluten-free. But some of the customers that we're working with, which I think is a really important piece for our ecosystem when we think about sustainability, are blending chickpea with wheat and with other substrates. And that's so important because it allows us to maintain some of the gluten function that's required for some of these applications, but get some of the benefits that come along with chickpea and create that demand for growers. So we're going to see it in a lot of different applications, and we're working with protein processors as well. So that's going to start being, put into some of the chickpea proteins when you see that on the label. Some of those are going to be formulated with our high protein chickpeas.
Wow, very exciting. You mentioned one application that is of particular interest to me. You said talk about chickpea oatmeal. So, of course, to the average person, chickpea oatmeal sounds repugnant, I'm sorry to say, but I presume it's not just oatmeal with whole chickpeas sitting in there, right? So it's going to be something that looks more like regular oatmeal. And as you know, I am a big fan and a grower of mycoprotein, these fungi proteins that we do at the Better Meat Co. And a lot of the times we have what we call like fines, like flakes of mycoprotein that don't get used because they're too small. And I can't stand the thought of throwing anything out. Like they're totally fine. And in fact, they are fine. They are fines and they are totally fine. And so I make them into what I call mycote meal. And mycote meal is just like basically mycoprotein flakes that you use in replacement of oats. And so I love mycote meal. And I actually think there's like a real application commercially for this too. So maybe we'll get a NuCicer chickpea plus Better Meat Co. mycoprotein flake that we can combine. So you'll have still a gluten-free product that you'll be able to enjoy there.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah, I hope one day I'll give you a bowl of mycote meal. You'll enjoy it, I promise you. Okay, you mentioned there's 24 people or so working at the company now. How much money have you raised?
Yeah. So when we started the company, we were fortunate enough to launch through a $1 million grant from the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research, FAR. And that got us going. And then since that point, we've raised an additional $11.7 million in funding through a round led by Lever VC and then a subsequent round that was led by the Leaps by Bayer team. So We've been really excited to have, those investors and a handful of other really instrumental investors kind of join us in this journey.
And I presume you will continue to fundraise. So when is the next time that NuCicer is going to be opening around?
Yeah. So yes, that's very true. I mean, we are, I think as a startup, you're never really not in fundraising mode in some ways, and we're actively having conversations with new investors that are interested in see the vision where we're going and kind of see the product. I think, one piece of this journey for me personally, and I think it's just an important, maybe message that some of the audience might resonate with. When I decided I was going to step away from big corporate culture and found a startup, I said to myself, I do not want to be fundraising for the rest of my life, right? I mean, don't get me wrong, for the investors out there, I really enjoy our conversations, but the reality is I want to found a stable business. And that means from day one, thinking about how to get to positive unit economics. And then after positive unit economics, how to get to the point that we have net profitability and can start really showing that we are an impact-driven business, but that impact comes with profit. And so from day one launch of our first ingredient, that ingredient is unit economic positive. And we do see a path in the next few years here to truly net profitability. And I think that that's one of the exciting things, that this is not technology that requires, another decade or so of inputs and getting to a certain scale before we start to kind of stabilize. We're picking technology that's transforming a crop that fits into existing manufacturing and production systems that allows us to tap into that. Yeah, I think that's an important piece. It's got to be around fundraising, but it's also at some point got to be about generating revenue, working with customers, and eventually being able to support yourself.
That's a truly radical idea. I wonder if they teach that in business school, that people can make a profit. I wasn't sure if that was still in vogue or not, but very cool. So, Catherine, we talked about one idea, maybe for another company then, to do their own NuCicer type technology to fava beans or even to yellow peas or something, right? So you can improve those. Maybe somebody else will do that. But are there other ideas that you hope somebody else will pursue that might make a positive impact in the world as well?
Yeah. So I think, one of the things that's kind of struck me as just a everyday consumer going through this process and getting into food and ag is that I fundamentally no longer believe we need to be making trade-offs in our decision-making when we go to the grocery store between flavor, nutrition, and affordability. So I would, if I had the opportunity, even though we're not a B2C company, we don't do brands, I would really encourage people on the food formulation, on the brand side of things. I think there's a huge opportunity right now to innovate. And instead of making healthy food taste healthy, right? I mean, let's let it be delicious and indulgent and affordable. I think that with some of the novel ingredients that are out there, NuCicer, but others as well, we're at this inflection point that we can really start doing that for consumers. And so I really want to see more brands, more people thinking about connecting back to new crops and to systems that actually support the grower when they're thinking about those food formulations. So for me, I'd say that's probably, if I wasn't doing this, an area that I would be working with, and I hope other people start to really think about.
Okay. So if somebody takes you up on this idea to make a really awesome tasting, but still healthy and grower productive foods here, what resources should they be thinking about, Catherine? Has there been anything that was useful for you in your own journey of entrepreneurialism that you think would be good for others to check out?
Yeah. One of the resources actually recently, just in the last, let's say 6 months, that I've really enjoyed is the book Think Again by Adam Grant. And what I found really interesting about this book, I think it's great not just for when you're starting a company, but really at any stage of building a company, is that it reminds us to rethink our assumptions and to continue to be curious and evolve our thinking. When you get down a path, let's say your plan A, or maybe it's your plan B of a company or any project that you're working with, you're running into challenges. And sometimes you need to, as hard as it is, you need to take a step back and completely rethink, reframe the situation. And I think in the book, Think Again, I think Adam does a really great job at giving some tools and really giving examples of why that's so important and how to go about doing that, so you can then really make a leap forward and accomplish and push through those challenges.
Okay. Well, that's cool. I haven't read the book. I do appreciate this recommendation, and we'll get to it. So we'll include the link to Think Again by Adam Grant in the show notes of this episode at businessforgoodpodcast.com. But for now, Catherine, I want to say thank you. I can't wait to try the NuCicer high protein oatmeal. That sounds absolutely fantastic. And I will gladly trade you some mycoprotein that we can compare notes on how the mycoatmeal and the NuCicer meal taste. So I'll look forward to that very much. I'm rooting for your success, and I am really thrilled by everything you're doing to bring the humble chickpea closer to the center of our plate.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, Paul. I really appreciate it. And yeah, look forward to talking again.
Thanks for listening. I hope you found it useful, and if you did, please let the world know. Leave the show a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast app and share the episode with your friends. Who knows? Maybe you'll inspire one of them to be in the business of doing good themselves.